Welcome all. I'm here to give you a bit of context and a bit of background to what you're about to hear next. I'm Julia Thornton. I'm the former chair and present secretary of the Victorian Branch of the Australian Fabians Society. Barry Jones was the intended speaker to address the Fabians' annual dinner, which was held on the 24th of October 2022. Unfortunately, Barry was struck down with what's known as the Melbourne cough, and it rendered him unable to speak just before he was to deliver his speech. So to help to bring you the speech as it should have been delivered, we've videoed him in the comfort of his own kitchen. Barry, who turned 90 years old in October, has made a gigantic contribution to Australian life and thought, not least by being an irritant and a sceptic. In what follows, these characteristics and his capacity for always producing an original angle and some facts that you never knew about come to the fore when in his exposition on the Republic in Australia and how we might get there.
In my introductory speech in both the Victorian Parliament in 1972 and the Commonwealth Parliament in 1978, I declared myself as being a Republican. And I was the deputy chair of the Constitutional Convention that was set up in February of 1998 in order to determine what form of proposition was going to put in a referendum on a republic in November 1999. And after the referendum's defeat, there's been a kind of 23-year hiatus on the issue, with some, I think, very largely ineffectual campaigning by the Australian Republican movement, the ARM, growing indifference in the Australian political elite, a commodification of royalty in a whole series of successful television series, and a 180-degree turn from ardent support by News Corp to quite significant opposition. Republican models became deeply unattractive, with the examples of Donald Trump, Jair Bolsonaro, Vladimir Putin, and Rodrigo Duterte. The Democracy Index of the Economist Intelligence Unit lists nations in order of the quality of their governments, having regard to democratic practice, independent judiciary, open institutions, and a free press. And of the top 12, 7 are constitutional monarchies: Norway, New Zealand, Sweden, Denmark, Australia, Netherlands, Canada. And there's a striking lack of enthusiasm in Canada for becoming a republic, and the same in New Zealand. In Australia, both major parties entered a virtual cone of silence during the lifetime of Queen Elizabeth. But with her death, a new approach may be possible. Who was King Charles I of Australia? Prime Minister Albanese, sure-footed on most issues since his election, seems slightly adrift after news of the sudden death of Queen Elizabeth on the 8th of September 2022 from old age. She'd looked reasonably robust 2 days earlier, appointing Liz Truss as Prime Minister. Not a pleasant task. Dying is what people in their 90s do. They're good at it. But the PM insisted that Australia was following a protocol dating from 1954, 9 years before he was born. He conceded he didn't know who made the protocol. Governor-General David Hurley declared King Charles III to be the country's head of state in a ceremony outside Parliament House in Canberra on September the 11th. The proclamation read, "We now proclaim Prince Charles Philip Arthur George to be King Charles III by the grace of God, King of Australia and his other realms and territories, head of the Commonwealth, and with hearty and humble affection we promise him faith and obedience. The use of the term obedience in the proclamation of Charles III as King of Australia came as a shock. Humble, as in humble affection? When do we get up from our knees? Faith? What faith is that? Would that be the Church of England as shaped by Henry VIII? Obedience? Seriously? King Charles III gives an order and we obey? The Australian Parliament abandoned its sittings. The United Kingdom Parliament continued them. Does this make sense? Not to me. Commonwealth MPs and in Victoria had to be re-sworn because the head of state, last seen here in 2011, had died. Judges, however, did not have to be re-sworn. And who was King Charles I of Australia? Was he executed? Was he aware of Australia? Did he make any claims on it? Is the British King Charles III and the Australian King Charles I, aka Charles III, bound in practice to accept advice from both his British and Australian Prime Ministers? And what happens if they conflict, for example, on climate change? The major problem is the Australian Constitution. Get that right, and the monarchy is then repatriated. The one big idea that I want to argue for this is this. It's a major mistake to address the Republic issue in isolation, as if it was all that mattered. The simplest action and the national priority must be to change the Constitution so that it reflects current practice, rather than our historic relationship with an absentee monarch whose distance may actually lead enchantment to the view. We must come out of the closet. We should come clean and acknowledge that in practice we've already adopted republican forms and the Viceroy to the head of state has become a cipher. However, we cannot bring ourselves to use the R word, republic. And this is gold medal hypocrisy. Drawing attention to the urgent need to make the Constitution relevant will involve a major education campaign. We must explain what is in the Constitution and what is not. Schools, university, the media in all forms will have to be involved. Also, communities. It's a matter of being honest with ourselves. The Republic versus monarchy impasse illustrates a disturbing degree of Australian infantilism, lack of faith in our own institutions, and an ingrained pessimism that if we attempted to change the status quo, we'd muck it up. Infantilisation is essentially a reluctance to leave home. Our view of history was distorted with many of our leaders. John Howard, for example, acting as if Australia's history had begun quite abruptly on the 26th of January 1788, that the First Nations history was irrelevant or peripheral, and we never had to address issues such as the frontier wars, slavery, racism, class, inequality. And our political system was explained wrongly as being a simple transplant from home, the United Kingdom. I have strong childhood memories of relatives who spoke lovingly and often of home, a place they'd never seen. The Australian colonies were well in advance of home in adopting political reform and edging towards democracy. We had universal manhood suffrage in the 1850s, but in Britain, not until 1918, much later than in Germany or Austria. Universal female suffrage in the Commonwealth was in 1902, in Britain in 1928. We were pioneers of the secret ballot, payment of members, an elected upper house, still lacking in Britain, and an independent electoral commission to draw electoral boundaries. And yet, John Howard and his followers distorted history by insisting that the Westminster model had been graciously bestowed on us, and weren't we lucky. The Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia in 1900, not bad, but not fit for purpose. There was a remarkable paradox at the core of the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. Australia's constitution is the only one in the world where the text was adopted by direct vote of citizens, overwhelmingly male, in a referendum. However, the Constitution makes no reference to democracy, democratic practice, or the system of responsible government as we've experienced it for 122 years. The Commonwealth Constitution was an anachronism from the outset, as Henry Bourne Higgins and others pointed out at the time. The three leaders of the Federation movement, Edmund Barton, Alfred Deakin, Charles Kingston, all recognised the limitations in the Constitution as enacted. However, they took a pragmatic decision to work around it rather than attempting to negotiate improvements for another 5 or 10 years. The United States Constitution dates from 1789 and has been amended 27 times since then. It begins with the words, "We the people." And the US government still operates pretty much as written in the Constitution. The Australian Constitution dates from 1900, and although the product of referenda in the colonies, which then became states, and beginning with the words, "the people have agreed," it is in form an act of the United Kingdom Parliament, a gracious gift to a distant child. In practice, it's proved very difficult to amend. Only 8 referenda have been carried, the last in 1977. Under the Australian Constitution, there are only 2 prerequisites for our head of state, following the British Act of Settlement 1701. The King or Queen must be a descendant of the Electress Sophia of Hanover and must not be a Catholic. Until the UK law was changed in 2013, there was a 3rd prerequisite, must not be married to a Catholic. So far, these conditions have been met. Is that enough for the future? Robert French, later Chief Justice of the High Court, commented in May 2008, "It is unacceptable in contemporary Australia that the legal head of the Australian state, under present constitutional arrangements, can never be chosen by the people or their representatives, cannot be other than a member of the Anglican Church, can never be other than British, and can never be an Indigenous person." I find it hard to improve on that. If students ask me for advice about how the Commonwealth Government works, I encourage them to stay clear of reading the Australian Constitution, which would only confuse them. The biggest problem would be to actually apply the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia, this jewel of a constitution, as David Flint said, the world's best constitution, as Kerry Jones said, as it is written. That would really frighten the horses. Sovereignty would be centred in the United Kingdom. The office of Prime Minister would disappear. The Governor-General would act as Commander-in-Chief, perhaps in the field, make all appointments, frame the budget, and legislation could be vetoed or referred to Buckingham Palace at whim. Defenders of our existing constitutional arrangements say, in effect, "I oppose any change to the Australian Constitution, although I've never read it and have no idea what's in it." That's the position that needs to be questioned, challenged, shaken. It will be central to adopting the voice, which will precede, correctly, I think, any substantial move on a republic. At one time, I used to ask defenders of the constitutional status quo if they were prepared to assert in public they believe it was right for the executive power of the Commonwealth to be vested in the sovereign, section 68, for the sovereign to retain the power to veto legislation, sections 58, 59, 60, for the Governor-General to be Commander-in-Chief of our armed forces, section 68, for the Constitution not to contain any express commitment to democracy or democratic practice or to responsible government, for there to be no provision for a Prime Minister and Cabinet or an opposition, for ministers to be chosen by the Governor-General, for us to be described not as Australian nationals but as subjects of the Queen, section 127, and, until 1967, for there to have been no reference to our First Peoples except that they were not to be counted in the census. The last exercise of the sovereign's power to veto legislation in Great Britain was by Queen Anne in 1707, even then on ministerial advice. But under the Commonwealth Constitution Act, section 58, 59, 60, the veto power is expressly preserved in Australia. Should this be a matter of concern or just ignored? It doesn't mean what it says. The sovereign's viceroy. From the outset, the Governor-General, although the central figure in the Constitution, rarely played a significant role. 7 of the first 8 Governors-General were amiable, chinless wonders appointed for Britain with little or no knowledge of or links with Australia. This gave the Prime Minister, not mentioned in the Constitution, a major tactical advantage. Oddly, more issues have arisen since Australians have been appointed to the office. The first Governor-General, the Earl of Hopetoun, made an egregious mistake in December 1900, known as the Hopetoun blunder, by commissioning the Premier of New South Wales, Sir Philip Lyne, to form the first Commonwealth government. This failed because Lyne had been hostile to federation and no other major political leader would serve under him. Hopetoun then had to commission Edmund Barton. Deeply embarrassed, Hopetoun soon left Australia long before his term was up. Of our 27 Governors-General, I would rank them as 13 duds, 7 fair, 4 excellent, 1 able but interventionist, 1 bad, and 1 imbecile. 15 have been Australian nationals. 2 were Jews, Isaac Isaacs, and 3 Catholics, Bill Hayden, a late conversion, Bill Dean, and Peter Cosgrove. Interestingly, Prince Charles, as he then was, lobbied for appointment as Governor-General in 1976, but the Queen opposed it. John Howard, ironically, played a major role in making the Governor-General a cipher by taking on some roles that would have been carried on by a head of state. I talked about the role of the Governor-General several times with Sir Ninian Stephen. He said, Bill Dean was the best of us all. That raises a serious question of how a male or female or Indigenous equivalent of Bill Dean could be recruited, let alone persuaded to run as a candidate if direct election was ever adopted. The Constitutional Convention of February 1998 and the failed referendum of November 1999. The Constitutional Convention, ConCon, met in Old Parliament House in Canberra from the 2nd to the 13th of February 1998. It was ably chaired by the Right Honourable Ian Sinclair. I was his deputy. Both of us had been appointed by John Howard. There was a mixture of elected and appointed delegates. On the first day, Clem Jones, leader of the direct elections team from Queensland, moved a procedural motion to allow the question of whether Australia should become a republic to be determined on the third day of ConCon rather than on the final day. This would have had the effect of settling the major issue, whether to be a republic, at an early stage, putting pressure on all delegates to find the best mechanism for implementation. Unfortunately, the two major groups, the Australian Republican Movement and Australians for a Constitutional Monarchy, opposed Clem Jones's motion, and it was soon defeated on the voices. This proved to be a serious mistake. It had two deplorable results. It meant that the fundamental issue, republic or not, was swamped by a subsidiary issue, the mode of election or appointment. Second, it marked the beginning of open warfare between the two Republican camps. The Republican versus Republican divide became far deeper and more bitter than the Republican versus monarchist one. Malcolm Turnbull, leader of the ARM, and Lloyd Waddy, leader of the ACM, had a very civilised relationship. If there was a master plan to derail ConCon by allowing the secondary issue to overwhelm the first, this is when it happened. But the ARM collaborated in the process, so a conspiracy is unlikely. In the referendum held on the 6th of November 1999, there was a curious alliance between monarchists and direct election Republicans in the No campaign. Both opposed the bipartisan model, which provided for the Governor-General to be replaced by a president who'd act as an apolitical head of state and to be chosen by a joint sitting of the Parliament with a two-thirds majority being required. This would inevitably have resulted in the choice of a consensus figure and would have excluded a partisan. The monarchists thought the proposition was too Republican. The direct electionists thought it was not Republican enough, insisting that if the yes proposition was defeated, it would be quickly replaced by a new Republican model. More than 20 years on, there's no sign of this happening. The ARM proposed a new model in 2022, but it had so little impact that I cannot remember what was in it. In 1999, of Australia's then 148 federal electorates, 42 voted yes. Essentially, Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra voted yes. The other capital cities, rural and regional areas, voted no. It looked like a triumph for the monarchists, but the composition of the no vote deserves closer examination. The result cut across party lines completely. John Howard, then Prime Minister, and a vehement opponent of the Republic, was presumably mortified when his electorate, Bennelong, recorded a 54.6% yes vote. Opposition leader Kim Beazley, who supported the yes case, was probably stunned when his electorate of Brand voted no by 66.3%. My estimate is that of the 55% of Australians who voted no, perhaps 30% supported a monarchy, 10% were direct election Republicans, and 15% were simply not interested and would not have voted in a non-compulsory poll. Public opinion polling indicated a strong correlation between income and voting in referenda, with people on high incomes voting yes and those on low incomes voting no. And there's a strong correlation between levels of education and age in referendum votes. What must be done? Aboriginal reconciliation and the Republic are inextricably linked. The monarchist cause is essentially the last expression of white Australia. Its rhetoric, culture, ceremonials, politics, and the habit of deference. It's a static, essentially nostalgic position in a society that, although dynamic in some ways, is uncertain how to express itself. It's the politics of amnesia. The Republican cause is essentially multicultural, pluralistic, independent and irreverent. In a word, Australian. However, after 2 decades of only muffled, even muddled debate, the cause does not excite mass support, for example, in traditional blue-collar Labor electorates. For a constitutional referendum to succeed, a proposition must secure a majority of the popular vote and a majority of states, that is, 4 out of 6. Defeating a proposition is comparatively easy if the No campaign concentrates all its efforts in 3 states, say Queensland, South Australia and Tasmania. A narrow vote for No in 3 states would be decisive, even if the yes vote was overwhelming in New South Wales, Victoria and Western Australia. Following the New Zealand model, which led to a change in the structure of Parliament by introducing a mixed member proportional component, I'd begin with a national plebiscite to test public opinion for an in-principle support of a future constitutional referendum. And the question would be this: should the Constitution be changed to recognise existing practice in which 1. Australia is declared to be a democracy, 2. Australian nationality is recognised, 3. The head of state is an Australian citizen who does not exercise executive power and acts on ministerial advice, 4. The House of Representatives determines after a general election how government is to be formed, and 5. A Prime Minister and Cabinet exercise executive power. And if approved by a majority of voters, would then be submitted for adoption in a constitutional referendum which offered a choice between the new model and retaining the status quo. I always deplored the proposition that Australia's transition to a republic should be determined by an external event over which we have no control, namely the death of Queen Elizabeth II. It demonstrated my concern that the centre of our constitutional sovereignty is not located in Australia. It moves around from London to Windsor to Sandringham to Balmoral to Highgrove. Would United Kingdom citizens be attracted to a monarchy based in Australia if Charles III relocated here? It was odd that so many Australians had more faith in someone else's institutions than our own. They cannot bear the thought of leaving home. In 1998, I'd been uneasy about direct election of a president because of concerns that there could inevitably be conflicts between a directly elected head of state, plausibly able to claim a national mandate to exercise authority, and a Prime Minister who emerged from a parliamentary process, courtesy of, until now, the major parties, via the murky factional system. I concede that direct election has generally worked well in the Irish Republic, where there's a mixture of direct and indirect processes. A direct election takes place only if the Parliament, the Dáil Éireann, is unable to agree on a consensus candidate. But 2 directly elected Irish presidents in recent decades have been much admired, Mary Robinson and Mary McAleese. The presidency was offered in 2011 to the poet Seamus Heaney, who declined. So there are 3 outstanding problems remaining. First, lack of ambition, the idea we'd muck it up. Second, the insufficiency of reason. Rationality lacks the psychological carrying power needed to embrace far-reaching reforms. If an old system is to be replaced, a new myth must be created to replace it. And the central dilemma: the minimalist model, why bother? The maximalist model, you may wreck the joint. Role of political parties, how do you get an elected president, head of state, who is above politics? And that's the case. It's the Constitution, stupid. That's where we've got to put our emphasis.